She had fed this town for 7 years. Every birthday cake, every wedding loaf, every loaf of bread pressed into grieving hands after a funeral, and not one person thought she deserved love. They said Hannah Brooks was too plain, too wide, too much of everything except what a man supposedly wanted. But on the day she walked into Luke Carter's barn and said the 3 words she'd swallowed for 3 years, everything in Red Creek cracked open. If you've ever been told you were too much or never quite enough, this story is for you. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Hannah's story travels. The bread was done by 4 in the morning. Hannah Brooks had been awake since 2:30, same as every other day, moving through her bakery by lantern light, the way some people moved through prayer, quietly, deliberately, like the work itself was the only honest thing left in the world. She shaped the loaves with flour-dusted hands, slid them into the stone oven her father had built the year she was born, and listened to Red Creek sleep. It was the only hour the town didn't have opinions about her. By the time sunrise crept over the Wyoming peaks and painted the dust on Main Street a shallow gold, the bakery window was already fogged with warmth and the smell of something good. Hannah unlocked the front door at 5:30, same as always, and tucked a strand of brown hair back beneath her kerchief. Red Creek was a town of about 400 souls, if you counted generously, sitting at the base of a long, treeless valley about 30 miles east of the territorial capital. It existed the way a lot of frontier towns existed, through stubbornness and necessity, neither thriving nor quite dying. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a listing steeple, 2 saloons, and a sheriff who was more interested in keeping the peace than enforcing the law. The railroad had passed them over by 11 miles, which some people resented and others quietly appreciated. Hannah's bakery sat on the north end of Main Street between the post office and a closed-up millinery that hadn't seen business since the milliner's wife ran off with a traveling preacher 4 years back. The bakery had no proper name on the sign, just H. Brooks Breads and Pastries painted in faded green letters by Hannah herself, the summer she took the place over from her mother. That had been 7 years ago. Hannah was 31 now, and sometimes she felt every single one of those years in the bones of her hands. Mabel Hutchins was the first customer that Tuesday morning, the way she almost always was. She was a bird-like woman with sharp cheekbones and the particular energy of someone who had never in her life considered that her observations might be unwelcome. "Hannah," Mabel set her coin purse on the counter and peered through the glass at the loaves. "You look tired." "I'm always tired, Mabel. I wake up at 2 in the morning." "You ought to get some help in here, a girl, maybe." Mabel tapped the glass. "One of those 2 sourdoughs on the left." Hannah wrapped them without being asked. She knew everyone's order. She'd known Mabel's for 6 years. "And those sweet rolls? Are those the ones with the cardamom?" "Same as last week." "I'll take 3. My sister's visiting from Laramie." Mabel straightened up, tucking the wrapped bread under her arm with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. "She's got a boy, 26, works at the bank." "That's nice." I could put in a word. Hannah kept her face still. She had gotten very good at keeping her face still. "I appreciate the thought, Mabel. It's just—" Mabel paused in a way that meant she had been waiting to say this and simply needed a natural opening. "You're not getting any younger, dear, and men in a town like this, they want something particular, something—" She gestured vaguely at Hannah in a way that managed to encompass everything about her. "Manageable." Hannah handed over the rolls. "Have a good morning, Mabel." After the door swung shut, Hannah stood at the counter for a moment and said nothing. She was used to this. Being used to it didn't mean it didn't land, but she had learned a long time ago that reacting gave people material, and she wasn't interested in giving Mabel Hutchins material. She wiped down the counter and went back to the kitchen to check the second batch. The morning ran the way mornings always did. Farmers came for plain loaves. The schoolteacher, Mr. Dempsey, came for his weekly cinnamon bread and lingered to talk about nothing in particular. The Delacroix family, mother, father, and 4 children in descending size like stair steps, came in a cluster and let the youngest pick out a sugar cookie, which took 11 minutes and the negotiation skills of a territorial diplomat. Hannah liked these people, even the difficult ones. She liked Mabel's sharpness and old Dempsey's wandering conversation and the way the Delacroix children pressed their noses to the glass case and fogged it with their breath. She liked being useful. She liked that her bread went home with people and sat on their tables and fed their families. What she had not fully accounted for, in the years she'd been building this life, was how thoroughly a person could be appreciated and still be invisible. The women in town thought of her as capable. The men thought of her as solid. Both of these words meant the same thing, really, that she was someone to count on, not someone to covet. She was useful the way a good well was useful. Nobody sat around composing poetry about a well. She had made her peace with most of it. Most days, anyway. Thursday came like Thursdays always did, and Hannah was ready. Not in any obvious way. She didn't dress differently or arrange her hair differently or set out anything special on the counter. She simply knew, the same way she knew when the oven had hit the right temperature without touching it, that Luke Carter would walk through her door sometime between 10 and 11 in the morning. He had been coming every Thursday for 3 years. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch boards, a particular unhurried cadence she had memorized without meaning to. The bell above the door gave its small brass sound, and then he was inside, filling the doorframe the way large men tended to do, bringing with him the smell of horses and cold air and pine resin that she associated with nothing else in the world but him. Luke Carter was not a handsome man in the way that word got used in dime novels. Nothing fine or polished about him. He was weathered in the face and built like someone who had spent the better part of his life doing work that required his whole body. He had dark hair that was always slightly too long in the back, and a jaw that he kept clean-shaved about 4 days out of 7. He was 35, ranched about 9 miles south of town on land his father had homesteaded, and he had a reputation among the townspeople as quiet, reliable, and not a man you push twice. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Hannah had already started reaching for the whole wheat loaves. "Same as usual, please." He moved to the counter and settled his forearms on the edge of it, easy and unhurried, like a man without anywhere else to be. "Cold out there? That a problem with the bread?" "Took a little longer to rise this morning, but it came out right." She wrapped the 2 loaves in cloth and set them down, then looked up at him. "How's the bay mare?" Luke's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something that acknowledged one. "Skittish. She doesn't like the cold either, as it turns out." "Is she the one that threw your hand?" "That was the roan. Different mare altogether." "How many horses do you have that hate you?" "Current count is 3, he said. "I'm working on building the number up." Hannah felt the laugh come out before she could decide whether to let it. It happened like that around him. Things arrived before she'd managed to think them through first. "You're doing a fine job of it." He paid her, always exact, always without making her count change. And then, same as every Thursday, he didn't immediately leave. He stood at the counter and talked to her, not about anything particular, about the weather, about a fence line he was mending, about a cow that had gotten loose 2 weeks running and he was starting to think was doing it deliberately. Hannah listened and she talked back, and they stood on opposite sides of a wooden counter and had the most ordinary conversation in the world, and it meant more to her than anything else in her week. That was the problem, and she knew it. She had known it for a long time. Somewhere in the second year of his Thursday visits, she had stopped pretending to herself that she was simply glad for the business. He was gone by 11, loaves tucked under his arm, back to the ranch and his work and his life. Hannah watched him go through the front window, the way she did every week, and then turned back to her counter and told herself the same things she always told herself. He was a customer. A friendly one, yes. One of the few people in Red Creek who talked to her like she was actually worth talking to, who looked her in the eye and asked questions and listened to the answers. But that wasn't love. That was decency. Those were different things, and she had been foolish enough once or twice to mix them up. She was not, she reminded herself, a woman who could afford confusion about this. April turned toward May, and Red Creek stirred out of its winter stiffness the way it always did, slowly, with complaints. The mud season stretched on. Hannah ordered more flour from the supply wagon and planted sweet peas along the back fence of her lot, same as she did every spring. It was on a Wednesday in the second week of May that the stranger arrived. He came in on the afternoon coach from Cheyenne, a good coach, well kept, not one of the rundown ones that typically came through Red Creek. Hannah didn't see him arrive. She only heard about it from Tommy Pratt, who came in for a roll at 3 o'clock and was already vibrating with the news. "Big cattle buyer," Tommy said. sugar roll in one hand, leaning on the counter like he was paid to be there. Name's Whitmore, Nathan Whitmore. Got rooms at the hotel, the good ones, upstairs. People are saying he's here about the Carmichael herd. The Carmichael herd's 140 head, Hannah said. That's worth coming from Cheyenne for? If the price is right. Tommy shrugged. He's got money, that's what Hector said. Fancy coat, gold watch. Hannah filed this information away in the part of her mind she used for things that were interesting but probably irrelevant to her life, and went back to her bread. Nathan Whitmore came into the bakery the following morning, and Hannah revised her mental image immediately. She had pictured something soft. A city man, buttoned up and polished, the kind who looked at a frontier town with barely hidden distaste. Whitmore was none of that. He was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, in a way that suggested he'd done physical work at some point in his life before the money came, with a neat brown beard and pale eyes that moved around the bakery with genuine curiosity rather than the assessment she'd expected. "Miss Brooks?" he said, reading the sign on the wall. "That's right. Nathan Whitmore. Someone at the hotel told me your bread was the best thing in town." They weren't wrong. She said it without thinking and then half expected him to bristle at it. Men sometimes bristled when a woman spoke plainly. But he just smiled. "Good. I like someone who knows what they're worth." He looked at the case. "What would you recommend?" She recommended the sourdough and then spent 10 minutes explaining her process when he asked, and was slightly startled to realize he was actually listening. Not nodding politely. Actually listening, with follow-up questions about the starter culture and the stone oven and whether she'd ever considered expanding. He bought 2 loaves and a half dozen rolls, paid more than she asked, and told her he'd be back tomorrow. He was. And the day after that. By the end of the second week, Mabel Hutchins had already drawn conclusions, shared them with at least 12 people, and begun positioning herself as someone with insight into the situation. "He's taken with you," Mabel told Hannah, with a satisfaction that suggested she had personally arranged this outcome. "Everyone can see it. He comes in every single day. He likes the bread." "Hannah!" Mabel gave her the look she reserved for particularly thick-headed statements. Men do not travel across a bakery twice a day because of bread. Hannah wasn't sure that was true. She had met men with real commitment to good food, but she didn't argue the point. The truth was more complicated than she knew how to explain to Mabel, or to herself, honestly. Nathan Whitmore was attentive and thoughtful and openly admiring in a way that very few people in Hannah's life had ever been. He asked about her opinions on things. He told her about his work without turning it into a lecture. When he laughed, it was at actual things, not the performative laughter men sometimes use to fill silence. He was a good man. She was increasingly certain of this. She was also increasingly aware that when Thursday came around that week, and the bell above the door made its small brass sound and Luke's boots hit her floor, something in her chest did something that Nathan Whitmore's attentions, however genuine, had not managed to produce. Luke noticed something, she wasn't sure what. She had tried to be normal, had tried to simply be herself the way she always was on Thursdays. But he was sharper than people gave him credit for, and he paused in the middle of saying something about the fence line and looked at her. "You all right?" "Fine." She kept wrapping the bread. "You went somewhere for a second." "I'm right here." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable quiet. Luke Carter had never seemed uncomfortable with silence, which was one of the things that distinguished him from most of the men she dealt with. Just thinking. "Heard there's a fellow from Cheyenne staying at the hotel," he said finally. "Cattle buyer. Whitmore. He been in here?" She looked up. Luke's expression was unreadable in the way it sometimes was, that flat, careful look that could mean anything. "He has," she said. "He likes the sourdough." Something moved through Luke's face that she couldn't name. "Good," he said, and said nothing else about it. He left at 11:05. Hannah stood at the window the same as she always did and watched him go, and thought about how he had said good and what precisely he had meant by it. Nathan Whitmore asked her to supper on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of May. He did it properly. Came to the bakery after closing time, when the flour was put away and the oven banked for the night, and stood at the counter with his hat in his hands and asked her directly, like a man who had made a decision and wasn't in the habit of wavering once he had. I'd like to take you to supper, Miss Brooks, if you're willing, at the hotel dining room, Saturday evening. Hannah looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. Why? She said. He tilted his head slightly. What do you mean, why? I mean, why me, specifically? There are other women in this town. There are, he agreed. But I've spent 3 weeks talking to you every morning, and you're the most interesting person in Red Creek by a considerable margin. Also, your bread is genuinely extraordinary. He said the last part seriously, like it was relevant evidence. Hannah almost laughed. I'm a baker. I know what you are. His voice was quiet and direct. I'm asking you to supper. You can say no. That's entirely your right, and I'll respect it, but I'd like you to come. She said yes. She spent the rest of the evening trying to understand exactly why she felt uneasy about it. The supper was fine. Better than fine. Nathan was good company, asked good questions, and didn't talk over her once, which put him ahead of a number of men she had dealt with in her lifetime. He told her about Cheyenne, about his work, about growing up on a cattle ranch in eastern Colorado that his father had eventually lost to drought. He was honest about that, didn't dress it up or pretend it had been other than it was. She talked more than she usually did with people. He drew it out of her somehow, the talking. Her mother's recipe for the cinnamon bread, the years she'd spent learning the bakery business by watching her mother work, the plans she had for expanding if she could ever put aside enough for a larger oven. You should, he said, like it was simple. You have the talent for it, and the work ethic. It takes more than talent and work ethic. Capital, yes, I know. He didn't say anything else about it, but something in the way he said it made her think he was not letting the thought go, just setting it aside. She walked home alone afterward, her breath visible in the spring-cold air, and stood at her back door for a moment looking at the sweet peas coming up along the fence. She liked Nathan Whitmore. She liked him genuinely, which made this harder, not easier. Because what she felt walking home from supper with Nathan Whitmore was the comfortable warmth of a good evening well spent. And what she felt every Thursday morning when she heard those particular boots on her porch boards was something she had no comfortable word for, something that started in her chest and radiated outward and had no business being as powerful as it was over a man who bought bread. She thought about it for a week. She tried to be logical about it. Nathan was real and present and clear-eyed about what he wanted. Luke had never said a word. 3 years of Thursdays, 3 years of conversation and laughter, and that particular quality of being truly seen, and not one word. Maybe Mabel was right in her infuriating way. Maybe Hannah was building something out of nothing. Maybe she was 46 years old inside her head, telling herself stories about a man who simply liked her sourdough and had decent manners. On a Tuesday afternoon, Nathan Whitmore came into the bakery late, after the last customer had gone, and sat down at the small table by the window that Hannah kept for waiting orders. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, directly, without maneuvering around to a point. I'm leaving Red Creek in 2 weeks, he said. The Carmichael deal is closed. I'll be heading back to Cheyenne. Hannah set down her cloth. I see, but I don't want to go the same way I came. He was quiet for a moment, measuring something. I want to ask you something, Hannah, and I'd like you to think about it before you answer. You don't have to answer today. What are you asking? I'm asking if you'd consider coming to Cheyenne. He said it plainly. Not immediately. I'm not trying to rush you into anything. I have a house there, a real one. Good house, big kitchen. I know people in the business community. With your skill, you'd have a bakery that could be 3 times the size of this one inside of 2 years. And I'd like... He paused, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he looked slightly less than entirely composed. I'd like someone to come home to. I'm being completely honest with you. I think you're remarkable, and I think you're wasted in a town that doesn't know what it has. Hannah looked at him for a long time. He waited. Nathan, she said carefully, I need to tell you something. He nodded. You are a genuinely good man. I want you to know that I mean that because I don't say things I don't mean. She folded her hands on the counter. And I have enjoyed every morning you've come in here. But there's something I need to do before I can give you any kind of answer to what you're asking. What's that? She had no good way to explain it, so she just said the plain version. I have to have a conversation with someone else. There's something I've been not saying for a long time, and I need to say it before I can make any decision about anything. I owe that to myself, and I think I owe it to you. To not answer you until I've been honest about something I've been putting off." Nathan looked at her steadily. He was not a stupid man. She thought he understood more of what she was saying than she had actually said. "All right," he said. "I'll have an answer for you by Friday." He stood, collected his hat. "For what it's worth," he said at the door, "the man would have to be a genuine fool not to see you clearly." He left. Hannah stood in her empty bakery for a while. The oven had gone cold, and the bread was all sold, and outside the window Red Creek was doing what it always did in the early evening, settling into itself, smoke rising from cook fires, a dog barking somewhere down the alley, the ordinary machinery of a small town winding down. She thought about 3 years of Thursdays. She thought about what it would mean to spend the rest of her life wondering. She went to the back room and took off her apron. She hung it on the hook where it lived. She washed her hands at the basin. Then she went to find her coat and her good boots, because 9 miles south of town there was a ranch, and she was done being the woman who kept her mouth shut and hoped for a miracle. She was going to Luke Carter's place. She was going tonight. The ride south took her 40 minutes on the road, longer than it should have because she almost turned back twice. The second time she sat stopped in the middle of the road for so long that her horse turned his head and gave her a look of profound animal skepticism. "I know," she told him. She kept going. The Carter Ranch came into view as the sun dropped toward the western ridgeline. A plain house, a good barn, 2 corrals and a pasture gate, the kind of place that showed careful maintenance without much in the way of comfort. A lamp was burning in the house window. She tied her horse at the post, walked to the barn because that was where she'd heard him working when she'd come out once before with a delivery. That had been 2 years ago, before she'd understood what was wrong with her, when she thought she was simply doing a favor for a good customer. The barn door was open. The lamp inside was throwing warm light on hay and horse flanks, and the back of a man working on a piece of harness leather, and she stood in the doorway for a moment with her heart doing something unreasonable in her chest, and then she stepped inside. Luke turned around. He saw her face, and something moved through his own, a quick involuntary thing, surprise, and something beneath it she couldn't name and almost didn't dare to. "Hannah." His voice was careful. "What's wrong? Is something wrong?" "No," she said. "Yes." She stopped. "I need to tell you something." He set the harness leather down slowly. He didn't say anything. He waited, which was a thing she had always noticed about him. He did not fill silences with noise just to fill them. And right now, in this barn with the lamplight and the smell of hay and the impossible moment she had ridden 9 miles to arrive at, she was deeply grateful for it. She took a breath. "I have been coming up with reasons not to say this for 3 years," she said, "and I have run out of reasons. There's a man who wants me to go to Cheyenne with him. He's good and he's honest, and I think he'd take care of me, and I cannot give him an answer until I've said something to you." Luke said very quietly, "What do you need to say?" The lamplight moved. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Outside, a night bird called once and went quiet. Hannah looked at Luke Carter and said what she had been not saying for 3 years. "I love you. I've loved you a long time. And I needed you to know that before I made any decision about the rest of my life. Because if I don't say it now, I'll be wondering about it when I'm 60, and I can't live with that." She had prepared herself for silence. She had prepared herself for kindness and rejection. The gentle, terrible kind that decent people offered when they didn't want to hurt you. She had prepared herself in her lowest moments on the ride out for pity. She had not prepared herself for what actually happened, which was that Luke Carter crossed the barn in about 4 strides and stopped close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face, and it was nothing she had expected. It was not pity. It was not even surprise, not really. More like a man who had been holding a breath for a very long time and had just been told he was finally allowed to let it out. "Hannah," he said, and his voice was entirely different than it had ever been in her bakery. She stared at him. "I have been trying to figure out how to say the same thing to you," he said, "for about 3 years." The barn was quiet. The lamplight moved. She said, "What?" He said, "I know." She said, "Luke Carter, you had better explain yourself right now." And he did. Standing in that barn with the night coming in and the horses listening and the lamplight making everything amber and uncertain, he explained himself, haltingly, in the way of a man who was not accustomed to saying hard things out loud, but completely. He told her how it had started and how it had built and why he had stayed quiet, which came down, in the end, to the most basic and maddening thing. He had looked at her and then looked at what he had. A struggling ranch, a modest house, years of hard work ahead before anything would be comfortable, and concluded with the confidence of a man who was wrong in a deeply important way that she could do better. Better, Hannah repeated. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Luke, you had a conversation about this. In your head, and in that conversation, you decided on my behalf. He had the grace to look like he understood exactly what she was getting at. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. She breathed out slowly through her nose. That, she said, is the most irritating thing anyone has ever done to me. I know. For 3 years. Hannah, I brought your bread home twice when you forgot to pick it up. I moved your order to the front of the line when you were running late. I thought about you every single Thursday starting on Wednesday night, which is honestly embarrassing, and you were out here deciding you weren't good enough. She shook her head. That's an extraordinary amount of deciding to do about someone else's feelings. He looked at her with that quiet expression, the one she could never fully read but was beginning to think meant he was trying very hard not to smile. Are you done? I have more. All right. She had more. And she said some of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, Luke reached out and took her flower-rough hand in his, and she stopped talking for a moment because of what that did. Outside, the dark had fully arrived. The stars over Wyoming were coming out in their thousands, the way they did out here away from town, extravagant and indifferent. The horses breathed their quiet horse breath. The lamp burned between them. I need to go back to town, she said finally. I know. I need to talk to Nathan Whitmore. Yes. She looked at his hand around hers. You should have said something 3 years ago. I should have, he agreed. And then, because he was Luke and not a man for unnecessary decoration. I'm sorry I didn't. She nodded once. She let herself stay another minute just standing there in the lamplight before she gently pulled her hand back and turned toward the barn door. I'll come back Thursday, she said. I'll be there. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. Don't forget to actually say things out loud this time. I'll work on it. She walked back out into the Wyoming night, untied her horse, and rode back toward Red Creek with the cold air on her face and the kind of feeling she had no word for. Not joy exactly, not relief exactly, something bigger than both that had no name, because nothing this particular had ever happened to her before. Red Creek's lights came up in the valley ahead of her, small and warm. She had an answer for Nathan Whitmore, and she had 9 miles to figure out how to give it. She got back to Red Creek a little past 9, and the town was mostly dark by then, the way small towns went dark. Not all at once, but in stages, one window at a time, until only the saloons and the occasional lamp in an upstairs room said anyone was still awake. She didn't go to the hotel that night. It was too late for the kind of conversation she needed to have. And besides, she hadn't worked out the right words yet. She put her horse up, walked home through the cold, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time with a cup of tea that went cold while she stared at the wall. She went to bed eventually. She didn't sleep much. By 2 in the morning, she was in the bakery, same as always, with her hands in the dough and her thoughts running laps around themselves. Work had always been the thing that organized her, not calmed her exactly, but gave the noise somewhere to go. She shaped loaves and the noise went into the bread, and by the time the oven was full, she had at least some idea of what she was going to say. Nathan Whitmore was in the hotel dining room when she went to find him the next morning, late enough that the breakfast crowd had thinned to almost nothing. He saw her come in and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, but a kind of careful preparation. The look of a man who had been expecting something he wasn't sure about. Hannah. He stood. Sit down, please. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down herself. I'm not going to make this longer than it needs to be. He sat. He folded his hands on the table and waited. You deserve someone who comes to you without a reservation in the world, she said. And I can't be that, Nathan. There's someone else. There's always been someone else. And I was fooling myself to think I could answer you honestly without settling that first. She met his eyes and held them, because he deserved at least that. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at her. Is it Carter? He said. She didn't ask how he knew. Men like Nathan Whitmore made their livings reading situations. Yes. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and set it back down. Does he know? He does now. Another silence. She watched him work through it. Not dramatically, not with anger, just a man absorbing information he didn't particularly want. She respected him for the way he did it. Well, he said finally, I appreciate the honesty. I would have appreciated it slightly more a week ago, but I understand why it took the time it took. That's fair. He's a lucky man. Whether or not he's smart enough to know it yet remains to be seen. He said it without bitterness, just observation. I'll tell him you said so. The corner of Nathan's mouth moved. Please don't. He stood again, offered his hand across the table. You're a remarkable woman, Hannah Brooks. I hope Red Creek figures that out eventually. She shook his hand. Safe travels back to Cheyenne. She walked out of the hotel into the May morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, feeling the particular strange lightness of having done a hard thing correctly. Not happy exactly. She'd disappointed a good man, and that sat with her. But clear. Cleaner than she'd felt in weeks. She went back to the bakery and opened up for business. Thursday was 4 days away, and they moved slowly. Hannah noticed, for the first time with full clarity, how much of her week had been quietly organized around that one morning. The bread she always made sure to have ready by 10, the way she found herself checking the clock at 9:30 with the particular attention she didn't apply to any other hour. She'd been doing this for 3 years and calling it habit, and it was only now, when she knew what she was actually waiting for, that she understood how thoroughly she'd been lying to herself. The rest of the week had its ordinary texture. Mabel came in Tuesday and had clearly heard something, because she was unusually quiet in a way that suggested she was waiting for Hannah to volunteer information. Hannah didn't volunteer anything. Old Dempsey came for his cinnamon bread and talked about a book he was reading. The Delacroix children pressed their noses to the glass. She planted more sweet peas on Wednesday afternoon, working the soil at the back fence while the light lasted, and thought about what Luke had looked like in the lamplight of his barn. That involuntary expression when he'd turned and seen her, that quick, unguarded thing before the careful look came back down over his face. She had looked at that face every Thursday for 3 years and never seen it quite like that. She put her hands back in the dirt and tried to be sensible. He came at 10:10 on Thursday, which was slightly later than usual. The bell rang and she looked up from the sourdough she was slicing, and there he was. Same as always, same unhurried way of filling a door frame, except that something was different and she felt it before she could name it. He was carrying wildflowers, not many, a small bunch of them, the early spring kind that came up in the grass along creek beds, yellow and white, slightly bedraggled from the ride. He crossed to the counter and set them down in front of her, and then straightened up and looked at her like he was daring her to make it difficult. She looked at the flowers. She looked at him. Don't say anything smart, he said. I wasn't going to. Yes, you were. She picked up the flowers. They smelled like cold and creek water and growing things. I talked to Nathan Whitmore, she said. How'd that go? About how you'd expect. She set the flowers aside carefully. He took it well. He's a decent man. Luke nodded. He said you were lucky, she added, whether or not you were smart enough to know it. Something moved through Luke's face. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, and then he said, He's right about the lucky part. The bakery was empty. It sometimes went quiet around 10, in between the morning rush and the midday run, and the light was coming through the front window at that particular May angle that turned everything slightly golden, and Hannah stood behind her counter with wildflowers in her hand and thought, This is actually happening. I've been thinking, Luke said. About what? He looked at her. About what it means to do this right. He said it carefully, the way he said things he'd been turning over in his head for a while. I didn't do right by you, not saying anything for 3 years. I'd like to do it right from here. What does that look like? He thought about it. He wasn't a man who answered before he'd thought. "It looks like me coming to town more than Thursdays," he said. "It looks like me taking you to supper. It looks like not keeping things quiet when they don't need to be kept quiet." Hannah set her elbows on the counter. "You know people are going to talk. They talk already. They're going to have opinions about—" She gestured at herself, a small, frank gesture. "You and me, specifically. I know. Mabel Hutchins alone is going to have opinions that could fill a newspaper." "Hannah." He waited until she looked at him. "I understand what I'm saying. I'm not asking you to be quiet about anything. I'm telling you I'm done being quiet." She studied him for a moment. He looked back at her with that steady look that she had spent 3 years trying to decode and was only now beginning to understand. That it was not blankness, had never been blankness, but a very deliberate kind of stillness that lived over a great deal of feeling. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Don't make me say it twice." He almost smiled. She was getting better at recognizing the almost. He bought his bread. He stayed longer than usual, almost an hour, and they talked the same way they always had, except that it was different now in a way that was hard to describe, some loosened thing between them, as if both of them had put something down that they'd been carrying too long. When he finally left, he paused in the doorway and looked back at her. "Saturday," he said. "I'll come Saturday, if you're willing." "I'm willing." He nodded once, and then he was gone, and Hannah stood at her counter with wildflowers in a cracked clay jar, and felt, despite her best attempts at level-headedness, like something in the world had tilted itself in a new direction. Red Creek noticed. Of course it did. Red Creek noticed everything, processed it through the particular machinery of a small town, and produced an opinion within about 48 hours. Luke Carter came to supper at the hotel dining room with Hannah Brooks on Saturday night, and by Sunday morning the story had passed through enough hands to have gathered several details that had not actually occurred. By Tuesday, Mabel Hutchins had come into the bakery with the expression of a woman who had been waiting patiently for a conversation and was no longer willing to wait. "So," Mabel said. Hannah wrapped her sourdough without looking up. "Good morning, Mabel. Luke Carter took you to supper." "He did, at the hotel. That's where the dining room is." Mabel set her coin purse down on the counter. "Hannah, I want you to understand I'm saying this as someone who cares about you." Hannah looked up. Mabel's face held what appeared to be genuine concern, which was more complicated to deal with than simple nosiness. "People are confused," Mabel said. "That's what I'm hearing. Not unkind, just confused. Luke Carter is—" She seemed to pick her words. "Well, he's a serious man, a respected man, and people are just wondering why he'd—" "Why he'd what?" Mabel had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Why he'd court someone so—" Another pause, and this one stretched longer, and Hannah let it stretch. "You know, when there are other options." The bakery was quiet for a moment. "Other options," Hannah repeated. "I don't mean it badly. I know exactly how you mean it." Hannah set the wrapped bread on the counter and kept her voice even. This was a skill she had been developing for 31 years. "You mean, why would a man like Luke Carter choose a woman who looks like me when he could choose someone prettier? That's what you're actually saying." Mabel's mouth opened. "That's all right," Hannah said. "You're not the only one thinking it. You're just the one who came in here and said it to my face, which I almost respect." She pushed the bread across the counter. "Your sourdough." "Hannah, Have a good morning, Mabel." Mabel left. Hannah went to the back room and stood at the sink and gripped the edge of it for a moment. Not because she was about to cry. She wasn't. She'd had the crying about this years ago. But because the tiredness of it was something she had never fully gotten used to. The way her own worth could be picked up and held to the light, and found wanting, in a conversation she hadn't been invited to have. She went back out to the counter. She had bread to sell. Well, Luke showed up on Wednesday, not Thursday, not Saturday, Wednesday, in the middle of the afternoon when the bakery had a lull. He came through the door, and she could tell by the set of his jaw that he'd heard something. "What did Mabel Hutchins say to you?" he said. Hannah blinked. "How do you know about that?" "Because Mabel Hutchins said it to her husband, who said it to the man he plays cards with on Tuesday nights, who happens to be the farrier who shod my horses this morning." He settled at the counter. "What did she say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before." "That's not an answer." Hannah looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not anger exactly, but something firmer than she was used to from him. She said people were confused, Hannah told him, about why a man like you would court someone like me. I gather someone like me means my appearance specifically. The firm thing in Luke's face became more pronounced. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to talk to Tom Hutchins, he said. Luke, not to cause trouble. I just think he should know what his wife is doing. It doesn't help anything. You talk to Tom, Tom talks to Mabel. Mabel feels embarrassed and triples down on her opinions. I've lived here for 31 years. I know how this works. He was quiet, which she had learned meant he disagreed, but was thinking about whether to push it. What does help? He said finally. She thought about it. You just keep coming in. Keep showing up. Let people see what you see. She shrugged a shoulder. Some of them will figure it out eventually. Some of them won't. But I've stopped needing every person in this town to understand my life. He looked at her for a long moment. You've had to do that for a long time. I have. Alone, she met his eyes. Mostly. He reached across the counter and covered her hand with his for a moment. A brief, deliberate thing, nothing dramatic about it, and then pulled back and straightened up. I've got fencing to finish, he said. I'll be here Saturday. I'll be here. He nodded and turned to go, and at the door he stopped and looked back at her. For the record, he said, I think Mabel Hutchins has a great deal of opinions about things she understands very poorly. He said it mildly, which somehow made it land harder. After he left, Hannah stood at her counter for a while, her hand still warm where his had been. The following week settled into something new. Not a routine exactly, but the beginning of one. Luke came on Thursday as always, and then again on Saturday, and on the second Wednesday he came without particular reason except that he had been near town for a supply run and stopped in. Hannah was not unaware of what that meant, for a man who measured his time carefully. The town talked. She had known it would. She was developing a practiced ability to hear certain conversations stop when she entered a room, to recognize the particular silence that meant something had just been said about her. She had experience with this, had been navigating some version of it her whole life. But this version had a different texture. Before she'd been invisible. Now she was conspicuous, and that was, in its way, harder. Invisible felt like nothing. Conspicuous felt like standing in the middle of a street with everyone watching. But Luke came on Saturday and walked her to the hotel dining room with his hand at her elbow, and he stopped to speak to the men he knew and introduced her, simply and without qualification, as though the only remarkable thing about the situation was that it had taken him this long to get around to doing it. Most of the men shook her hand and said something polite, and a few of them looked slightly puzzled and then looked at Luke's face and apparently decided the puzzle wasn't worth unpacking. She was beginning to understand something about Luke Carter, that his quietness was a form of authority. He didn't argue for her. He didn't defend her loudly or make speeches. He just stood next to her with the absolute lack of apology of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. And the people who respected him, which was most people, picked up on this and adjusted accordingly. It wasn't perfect. She didn't expect perfect. There were still conversations she wasn't invited to, still looks she caught from across the street. Mabel had not apologized and probably never would. But the landscape of it shifted, slowly, the way attitudes in small towns sometimes shifted when they had no choice. She thought about what he'd said in the barn that first night, that he'd decided she deserved better, on her behalf, without asking her. She still found it maddening. She had told him so again, on Saturday, over supper, and he had agreed with the equanimity of a man who was not going to argue about being wrong, which was its own kind of quality, she was realizing. He was not a perfect man. He was too quiet about things when he shouldn't be, too inclined to make decisions in his head before bringing them to anyone else, too slow sometimes to say out loud what he was thinking. He burned his own food routinely because he forgot to pay attention to it. He had a border collie who hated everyone except him, which said something, though she wasn't sure what. He kept things in his house at a level of organization that was more functional than orderly. Piles that meant something to him but would have been chaos to anyone else. She knew all this because she had been paying attention for 3 years, and because he told her more things now more readily, now that the door between them was properly open rather than cracked. She was, she thought, on a quiet Thursday afternoon in late May, with his bread wrapped on the counter and the wildflowers in the clay jar and the sweet peas blooming outside her window, beginning to understand what it meant to be actually known. Not managed, not tolerated, not assessed and found acceptable, which was the best most people had offered her. Known. It was strange and it was uncomfortable, and it was, she thought, probably the best thing that had ever happened to her. Tick. The trouble, when it came, didn't announce itself. It arrived the way most serious trouble did. Through the side door wearing something that looked routine until you looked closer. It was a Tuesday in the first week of June when Bill Haskell came into the bakery. He ranched north of Luke's place, 40 years in the territory. A big, barrel-chested man with a white beard and a habit of paying for his bread in exact change that he always seemed to have ready in his shirt pocket. He was not a man given to visible distress. He looked distressed now. He waited until the other customer, young Mrs. Ferris, who was buying rolls, had left, and then he put his money on the counter and looked at Hannah for a moment before he said anything. "You hear about the Meridian Land Company?" he said. Hannah shook her head. "No. What's that?" "Out of Cheyenne. They've been buying up land titles all over this part of the territory." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. An echo of Luke, she thought, that same gesture men in this country made when they were uneasy. Except buying's not quite the right word. More like claiming. They've been filing documents that say various ranches got problems with their original homestead filings. Paperwork errors, boundaries in the wrong place, and then they move in on it. Hannah was quiet for a moment, her hand still on the counter. Move in how? Legally. That's what makes it hard. Haskell's voice had the particular flatness of someone controlling something larger underneath it. They got a lawyer, fancy one, and they file the right papers in the right courts, and then you got 6 weeks to prove your title's clean, or you're dealing with a dispute you might not win, even if you're right. He picked up the bread. Luke got one of their notices yesterday. So did I. So did 3 other ranchers I know of. The bakery was quiet. How long has this company been operating? Hannah asked. Best I can tell, about 8 months. They did the same thing up near Casper. Most of those ranchers settled, took a payout for part of their land, and considered themselves lucky to keep the rest. Did they have a lawyer? Some did. Didn't seem to help much. Haskell looked at her. Luke's talking to a man in town about it. Fellow who does the land paperwork. Not really a lawyer, more of a claims agent. But the company's got real legal weight behind them. This isn't something an amateur handles. He left. Hannah stood at her counter and didn't move for a moment. Then she picked up the wildflowers from the clay jar, considered them, and put them back. She had some thinking to do. Luke came into the bakery that Thursday looking like a man who hadn't slept, which for Luke was a significant tell. He kept his tiredness in the usual places, the set of his shoulders, the slight slackness around his eyes, but Hannah had been reading him long enough to catch it. She poured him coffee without being asked. He didn't say anything about that. Haskell told me he talked to you, he said. He did. She leaned against the back counter. Tell me about the notice. Luke wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It came Tuesday. Official document from the Meridian Land Company through a lawyer in Cheyenne named Aldous Crane. Says there's a question about the eastern boundary of my property, that my father's original homestead filing in 1871 has a surveying error that puts about 60 acres in disputed territory. He paused. Those 60 acres have my main water access. The creek runs through them. Hannah was quiet for a moment. If they take those 60 acres, the ranch doesn't work, not as a cattle operation. I'd have to sell. He said it flatly, without the drama it deserved, which was how she knew it was bad. Have you looked at the original filing? I've looked at it. I don't know enough about survey law to know what I'm looking at. He set down the cup. I went to see Frank Daly. He handles land claims here in town. Frank says the filing looks clean to him, but he also said the company's lawyer is good, and if Crane says there's an error, there probably is one buried somewhere in the paperwork, even if it was never material before. What does that mean? Never material before? Means the error might be real. Small technical mistake in how the boundary was described. Wouldn't have mattered to anyone for 20 years because nobody disputed it. He looked at her. Matters now because someone decided it should. Hannah pulled out a stool and sat down. She was thinking about what Haskell had said, about the company doing the same thing near Casper, about the ranchers who'd taken settlements, about a lawyer good enough to find 20-year-old technicalities. Did Frank Daly say what your options were? Hire a real lawyer, which costs money I don't have fast, or at least not the kind a territorial land attorney's going to charge. A muscle worked in his jaw. Or wait and see if Crane actually files a formal challenge. Sometimes these companies send notices to see who flinches first. Do you think that's what this is? Testing to see who flinches? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I don't. 5 ranches all at once is too organized to be a fishing expedition. She nodded slowly. She was putting something together in her head. The shape of it not clear yet, but the outline starting to form. How many notices total? You said Haskell got one. Who else? Haskell, me, the 2 Pruitt brothers up on the North Fork, and a widow woman named Clara Voss who runs about 80 head on her own, 5 properties. All of them in the same valley corridor if you look at a map. Why that corridor specifically? Luke looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, why those 5 ranches? Why that particular stretch of land? There are ranches all over this county. She folded her arms. Is there something about that corridor? He was quiet, and she could tell she'd put her finger on something he hadn't fully turned over yet. The rail spur, he said slowly. What rail spur? There's been talk, nothing official, just territory gossip, about a potential rail spur coming through this valley, connecting to the main line up near Casper. If they were to build it, the corridor those 5 ranches sit in would be the most logical route. He stared at the counter. That land would be worth 10 times what it is now. The bakery was very quiet. So this isn't about technicalities in old homestead filings, Hannah said. No, Luke said. I don't think it is. She started at the beginning because that was the only place that made sense. That afternoon, after she'd closed the bakery and wiped down the counters, she sat at her kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew. 5 ranches. 1 company. A lawyer named Aldous Crane, out of Cheyenne. A rail corridor that wasn't officially a rail corridor yet, but might be. Notices citing surveying errors in original homestead filings. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote a question underneath it. Who files documents in the Territorial Land Office, and can ordinary people read them? The answer, she found out the next day, was that yes, the territorial land records were technically public. The catch was that they were kept in the capital, not in Red Creek, and there were a lot of them. She wrote a letter that evening to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, requesting copies of any filings related to the 5 properties and any documents referencing the Meridian Land Company. She kept the letter polite and specific and signed it with her name. She did not explain why she was asking. She mailed it Thursday morning, and then she went to find Bill Haskell. Haskell was not immediately receptive to the idea of organizing. He was a man who had spent 40 years solving his own problems, and the instinct to handle things privately ran deep. What exactly are you proposing? He said. He was standing at his fence line, fixing a post, and he didn't stop working while he talked to her. I'm proposing that 5 ranchers who've all received identical notices from the same company compare their paperwork, Hannah said. That's the first step. If the errors they're citing are similar across all 5 filings, that's a pattern. Patterns are useful. Haskell drove in a nail. Luke know you're doing this? Luke knows I'm thinking about it. And? And he didn't tell me not to. Haskell snorted, which might have been a laugh. That man! He stepped back and looked at the post. You know anything about land law, Hannah? No, but I know how to read documents, and I know how to find people who do know things. She paused. I'm a baker, Bill. I know how to take ingredients other people overlook and make something out of them. This isn't that different. He looked at her sideways. That might be the most peculiar thing anyone's ever said to me in 40 years of ranching. Is that a yes? He picked up his hammer again. I'll talk to the Pruitts. Can't promise anything about Clara Voss. She doesn't take easy to strangers coming on her land. Let me worry about Clara Voss. Clara Voss was 63 years old, weathered to something close to leather, and had been running her ranch alone since her husband's horse threw him into a ravine 11 years ago. She opened her door when Hannah knocked and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. You're the baker, she said finally. I am. Luke Carter's woman. That's a more recent development, yes. Clara looked her over with the deliberate assessment of someone who had learned to size things up quickly and trusted her own conclusions. What do you want? Hannah told her. Clara listened without interrupting, which Hannah was beginning to understand was a rare quality in people. When Hannah finished, Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at a point somewhere past Hannah's left shoulder. My husband filed that homestead claim in 1868, Clara said. Died 11 years ago. I have been running this operation by myself since then, and I have never once been told there was anything wrong with my paperwork. I know. 63 acres they're claiming are disputed, the east pasture and the high ground above the creek. Her voice was even. My hayfield is in that 63 acres. I lose that. I don't have enough winter feed. I'd have to sell down to almost nothing or go under entirely. I know that too, Hannah said. That's why I'm here. Clara looked at her directly. What makes you think you can do anything about this? You're a baker. These are lawyers and a company with money behind it. Hannah held the look. I don't know yet if I can do anything about it, but I know that 5 people facing this separately are weaker than 5 people facing it together. And I know that nobody's bothered to look carefully at what this company actually is and where it came from. Nobody in Red Creek has that kind of time. You're all running operations. I have evenings. The silence stretched. An old dog came around the corner of the house, looked at Hannah with milky eyes, and went back the way it came. Come in then, Clara said. Bummed. The letter from the Territorial Land Office came back in 10 days, and it was not as useful as Hannah had hoped, which was to say it was mostly a polite notification that records requests required in-person visits to the Capitol or a certified legal representative. However, it did include one thing she hadn't expected, a list of reference numbers for all filings associated with the Meridian Land Company as a matter of standard procedure. There were 47 of them. Hannah sat at her kitchen table and looked at that number for a long time. 47 filings. She'd known about 5 ranches in Red Creek. Haskell had mentioned similar activity near Casper. 47 filings across the territory meant this was not a company that had decided to try something. This was a company that had been doing something systematically for long enough to compile 47 legal actions. She needed those records. She couldn't get them herself, not without making a trip to Cheyenne that would take at least 4 days and leave her bakery closed. She wrote a second letter, this one not to the land office, but to Nathan Whitmore. She sat for a while after she wrote it, looking at his name on the envelope. Then she sealed it and set it aside. In the morning, she would think about whether to send it. In the morning, she sent it. Luke came Saturday, as he'd said he would, and Hannah spread out what she had on the kitchen table before supper. He sat down across from her and looked at the notes and the list of reference numbers and the map she'd sketched. Rough, approximate, marking out where the 5 disputed properties sat in relation to each other, and where a rail spur through the valley would logically run. He looked at it for a long time. 47, he said. 47. He sat back in his chair. He was doing the thing he did when he was thinking something through. Not restless, not performing thought, just quietly going somewhere inside his head while his hands rested on the table. She had stopped finding this disconcerting. She had started to read it the way she read the oven, knowing when to wait and when to check. The Casper ranchers who settled, he said finally, they took payments for part of their land. That's what Haskell said. Do you know what percentage, how much of their land they kept versus what Meridian ended up with? She didn't know. She wrote it down as a question. He watched her write it. I want to go to Cheyenne, he said. She looked up. Not instead of what you're doing, he said quickly. But someone needs to see those records, and I need to find a real land attorney, someone who can look at my filing and tell me whether there's actually an error or whether Crane is manufacturing one. That costs money. I know. He looked at the map. I've got some put aside, enough to pay for a consultation anyway. All 5 of you should go together, Hannah said, or at least have your paperwork looked at together. Separate consultations cost more. And a lawyer who sees 5 clients with the same problem from the same company is going to be more interested in the case than a lawyer who sees one. Luke looked at her. You've thought about this more than you've let on. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday. And the letter to Whitmore? She met his eyes. She had told him about it the previous day, not because she was required to, but because she had decided not to start a habit of keeping things from him. It had been slightly awkward. "I know people in Cheyenne," Nathan had said in his last morning at the bakery. She remembered it clearly. He knew the business community. He knew the city. He knew the kind of people who knew other people. "He knows land attorneys in Cheyenne," she said. "He knows people. I'm not asking him to do anything except point me toward the right names." Luke nodded slowly. She could tell he didn't love it. She could also tell he understood it. "All right," he said. "All right?" He looked at her. "Hannah, you're trying to save my ranch. I'm not going to argue about the method." Nathan's reply came 6 days later, and it was better than she'd hoped. He had written 4 paragraphs, efficient, organized, the letter of a man who had spent his professional life moving information, with the names of 2 land attorneys in Cheyenne, one of whom, a man named Robert Fitch, had experience specifically with territorial homestead disputes. Nathan noted without dwelling on it that Fitch had gone against corporate land interests before and was not afraid of the work. He also added, at the end, that if Hannah or anyone involved needed a contact at the Cheyenne business community who could speak to Meridian's reputation there, he was available. She showed the letter to Luke. He read it twice, handed it back, and said only, "He's a good man." "He is," Hannah agreed. She wrote to Robert Fitch the same evening. Quote, "The meeting happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the back room of the Red Creek Sheriff's Office, which Sheriff Beaumont lent them with the air of a man who wanted to seem involved without committing to anything. All 5 affected property owners came: Luke, Haskell, the Pruitt brothers, and Clara Voss, who arrived first and took the best chair without comment. Hannah had not organized this as a leader. She had organized it the way she organized bread production, figured out what needed to happen, determined the order, made sure the pieces were in place, and then stepped back from the ceremony of it. But when she stood in that back room with 5 ranchers who had more years in this territory than she had years alive, she felt the weight of it, the fact that these were people's lives, their parents' work, their futures. She unfolded the map. "I want to show you something," she said, "before we talk about individual paperwork or next steps or anything else." She spread the map on the table. "Look at the 5 properties. Look at where they sit." They looked. "Now look at this line." She drew it with her finger, running through the corridor. "That's where a rail spur would run if the territory approved one through this valley. The surveying party was through here 18 months ago. I asked around about that. And yes, there was a territorial survey team in this area in the fall of 1882. Most people thought it was for water rights mapping." "It wasn't," Henry Pruitt said. "I don't know what it officially was, but the land those 5 notices are targeting sits exactly along the path that Spur would take." The room was quiet. Clara Voss looked at the map with the stillness of a woman absorbing something she had suspected but not yet confirmed. "Somebody in the territorial government," she said. "Has to be. They'd know about the rail survey before it went public." "That's my thinking," Hannah said. "You got evidence of that?" the older Pruitt brother said. He wasn't hostile, just careful, the way men got careful when the stakes went up. "Not yet. That's what we need to find." She looked around the table. "Which is why I've been in contact with a land attorney in Cheyenne named Robert Fitch, who has agreed to review all 5 property filings, together, not separately, and to advise us on whether the survey errors Meridian is citing are genuine or manufactured." She paused. "And if they're manufactured, a lawyer who's looking at 5 identical manufactured errors has a different kind of case than a lawyer who's looking at one." Bill Haskell, who had been quiet since the meeting started, looked at her. "You did all of this in 2 weeks?" "I had evenings." Haskell made a sound that might, in another man, have been a laugh. Luke, sitting to her left, said nothing. He hadn't said much since they'd all come in, but she could feel him there, present and steady, the way he always was. "There's something else," Luke said then. The room shifted attention to him. "The 47 filings Hannah found. That's not 5 ranches. Meridian has done this across the territory, maybe more than once in more than one area. If Fitch can access those records and see the pattern, what we're dealing with isn't a local dispute. It's something bigger." "How much bigger?" Claire said. "That's what we need to find out." He looked at Hannah. She nodded. "That's where we are," she said. "We don't have answers yet. We have a map of questions. But we're asking them together now, which is better than where we were 2 weeks ago." The 5 ranchers looked at each other around the table. There was something in the room, not optimism exactly, more like the specific resolve of people who had been working hard land long enough to know that the only way through a hard thing was straight at it. Clara Voss folded her hands in her lap. "When does this lawyer want to see our papers?" Fitch wrote back within the week. He would come to Red Creek. He wouldn't make them all travel to Cheyenne, which Hannah had not expected and which said something about his level of interest in the case. He was coming the 3rd week of June. He wanted to see every document, every filing, every piece of paper related to the original homestead claims, and anything subsequent. He wanted the notices from Meridian. He wanted, if possible, any information about the company's principals, who actually owned and operated it. That last item was the one nobody had thought to look for yet. Hannah read that line twice. Then she went to her kitchen table, pushed aside the bread notes and the flour inventory, and wrote at the top of a new sheet, "Who owns Meridian Land Company?" She underlined it. The answer was somewhere in the 47 filings, or in the corporate registrations in Cheyenne, or in the name of the lawyer Aldous Crane's other clients. Information existed somewhere. It always did. The question was how long it took to find it, and how many people it implicated when you did. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on her porch. The particular cadence she had been recognizing for 3 years, that unhurried pace, and then a knock at her back door. She let Luke in. He looked at the paper on the table, the underlined question, and then at her. "You're not going to sleep, are you?" he said. Eventually. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same way he'd sat there on Saturday, comfortable, unhurried, as if her kitchen were somewhere he'd been coming for years, which it hadn't been, not yet, but he sat like it was. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "Someone needs to find out who Aldous Crane works for beyond Meridian," she said. "Not just who he bills, who hired him specifically for this. That kind of thing might be findable in Cheyenne if someone knows the right questions to ask." "I'll go to Cheyenne," he said. "I was already planning to go before Fitch said he'd come here. I need to see those land records myself. I can also ask around about Crane. Nathan might know," she said. "People in the cattle business in Cheyenne know the legal community. He offered to help." Luke looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'll write to Whitmore," he said. She blinked. "He offered to help," Luke said, "and we need help. Those 2 things are more important than whatever awkward thing it is that you think I'm going to feel about asking him." A pause. "I'm going to feel slightly awkward about it, yes, but I'll write the letter." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, patient and slightly dry, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had spent 3 years being wrong about how much was going on behind that careful face of his. "All right," she said. "All right." He reached across the table and moved the flour inventory off the corner of her notes so he had room to write. Outside, Red Creek was settled into its nighttime quiet. The horses in the stable, the cook fires gone dark, the saloon still murmuring somewhere down the street. The sweet peas were blooming along her fence. Somewhere to the south, 9 miles out, there was a ranch on a creek that someone was trying to take. And in her kitchen, a man was writing a letter to someone he'd rather not be writing to because the work required it. She pulled a second piece of paper toward herself and kept going. Luke left for Cheyenne on a Monday morning, and Hannah stood at the edge of her porch and watched him ride out with the particular feeling of someone who understood, for the first time in her life, what it meant to have something to lose. She went back inside and opened the bakery. The work helped, same as it always did. She shaped loaves and pulled rolls and made change and talked to the people who came in, and in the gaps between customers, she thought about the letter Luke had written to Nathan Whitmore and the one she had written to Robert Fitch, and the map on her kitchen table with its underlined question that still didn't have an answer. She had gotten very good, over the past 3 weeks, at holding several threads at once. It was not so different from managing a kitchen, knowing what was in the oven, what needed to go in, what was about to burn. Nathan's reply to Luke had come 2 days before Luke left, and it had been characteristically efficient. He knew Aldous Crane by reputation. A hired gun was how Nathan put it. A lawyer who worked for whoever paid him and had a particular specialty in territorial land disputes that most people didn't have the patience or knowledge to fight. He had also, more usefully, included the name of the man he believed was the principal behind Meridian Land Company, a territorial businessman named Gerald Howell, who sat on 2 corporate boards in Cheyenne and had, in Nathan's words, a long history of knowing about infrastructure projects slightly before they were announced. Gerald Howell. Hannah had written the name on her sheet and then sat with it for a while. A name was not evidence, but a name gave you somewhere to look. Robert Fitch arrived on the Wednesday of the 3rd week of June, 2 days before Luke was due back. He came on the afternoon coach, a compact man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and an ink stain on his left cuff that suggested he was not a man who stood on ceremony about his appearance. He checked into the hotel and came to the meeting the following morning with a leather case full of papers that he clearly knew how to use. The ranchers were all there again in the sheriff's back room, plus Hannah, plus Frank Daly, the local claims agent, who had been cautiously cooperative once it became clear that something larger than a routine dispute was developing. Fitch went through the paperwork methodically, which was to say slowly and without apology for the slowness. He read each filing, asked specific questions, made notes, and moved on. The ranchers answered what they could. Hannah answered what she'd been able to research. Frank Daly answered about the local recording process and when each document had been originally filed. After about 2 hours, Fitch set down his pen and took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "All right," he said. "Here's what I can tell you." The room got very quiet. All 5 notices cite surveying errors. Specifically, they claim the original boundary descriptions used an incorrect reference point, a landmark that has since moved or can no longer be verified. He put his glasses back on. In 4 of the 5 cases, the landmark in question is a creek bend. Creek bends move. That's a real phenomenon. Over 20 years, a creek can shift its course by several feet, sometimes more. Clara Voss made a sound. It wasn't quite a word. "However," Fitch said, and the however landed the way howevers did when lawyers used them. With the weight of everything that came before it stacked behind it, what Meridian is doing is arguing that because the landmark has moved, the original boundary is now legally indeterminate. That's a much larger claim than a surveying error, and it is a claim that depends entirely on a territorial land ruling from 1879, a ruling that was itself challenged and has never been definitively upheld by the full territorial court. Meaning, Haskell said, meaning Crane is building his whole case on shaky ground. The 1879 ruling was never settled law. If someone challenges it properly, at the right level, the entire foundation of these notices collapses. Fitch paused. "That's the good news." "What's the bad news?" Henry Pruitt said. "Challenging it properly means filing in territorial court. That takes time. Meridian knows this, which is why they gave you 6-week response windows. They're betting most of you won't have the resources to mount a territorial court challenge in that time frame, so you'll settle or default." He looked around the table. "And doing this right is not cheap. I want to be honest with you about that." The room absorbed this. "What does it cost?" Clara Voss said. She asked it the way she did everything, directly, without softening. Fitch named a number. It was not catastrophic, but it was not small either. Hannah watched the ranchers' faces. She could read the calculation going on behind their expressions. Not panic, but the specific arithmetic of people who lived close to their margins. "Together," Hannah said. "That's the number if all 5 cases are argued together as one challenge. Separately, it's more than double." Fitch nodded. "Miss Brooks is correct. The strongest play here, legally and economically, is to treat this as a single coordinated attack on multiple properties, because that's what it is. One filing, one challenge, one argument. That also makes the case significantly more interesting from a press standpoint." "Press?" Haskell said. "A company that has filed 47 similar actions across a territory, possibly acting on inside information about an unannounced rail corridor and using a contested legal ruling to dispossess legitimate homesteaders. That is not a private land dispute." Fitch's voice was dry. "That is a story. And stories have a way of making certain parties reconsider the expense of continuing." Luke came back on Friday, 2 days after Fitch's visit, looking like a man who had slept poorly in a city and was glad to be back in a place where things smelled like horses in space. He came to the bakery first, before the ranch, before unpacking, before anything. And Hannah thought about that later, what it said, and felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. She put coffee on. He sat down at her kitchen table and told her what he'd found. The land office records in Cheyenne had confirmed the 47 filings. But more than that, Luke had spent 3 days talking to people, the way you talk to people in a territorial capital when you were a rancher who looked the part and knew how to be patient and quiet in a way that made others fill the silence. He'd talked to other affected property owners whose names he'd found in the filings, 2 of whom were in Cheyenne pursuing their own hopeless-feeling legal efforts. He'd talked to a records clerk who had been quietly bothered by the volume of Meridian filings for 6 months and was not, technically, authorized to share certain things, but who had mentioned in an offhand way that the company's incorporation documents listed a registered agent, a law firm, whose other primary client was a member of the Territorial Land Commission. A member of the Land Commission, Hannah said. A commissioner named Arthur Peel. Luke's voice was quiet. He sits on the committee that reviews and approves infrastructure projects, including rail spurs. The kitchen was very still. Peel is connected to Meridian through the law firm, Luke said. Nathan's contact in Cheyenne confirmed it. This man Whitmore knows people. I'll give him that. Peel doesn't own Meridian directly. His name isn't on anything obvious, but the law firm that registered Meridian's incorporation is the same firm that handles Peel's private business interests. And Howell, who does run Meridian, has had dinner with Peel at least 4 times in the past year, according to the social columns in the Cheyenne newspaper. The social columns, Hannah repeated. Nathan's contact dug those up. Social pages in a capital city newspaper record who has dinner with whom. Apparently that's useful. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. It's not proof. I want to be clear about that. It's a pattern. Fitch said patterns matter. Fitch is right. He looked at her. Peel would know about the rail spur before any public announcement. He'd know which corridor was being considered. If he passed that information to Howell, and Howell used it to position Meridian to acquire that land before the spurs announced, that is not a land dispute. That is corruption. Hannah sat down across from him. She had known this was where it was heading, had known it since the night she'd first underlined her question and sat in the kitchen while he wrote his letter. But hearing it said plainly still landed differently than knowing it quietly. If it's corruption, she said, then this isn't something 5 ranchers fight in territorial court with a land attorney, however good. This is something someone in the territorial government needs to know about. Yes. Who do you trust in the territorial government? Luke was quiet. It was a genuine question with a genuinely uncertain answer. I don't know enough people there, he said, but Fitch might. And Nathan, Hannah said, he knows Cheyenne. He knows the business community. If Howell has a reputation there, Nathan knows it or can find out. She thought about Nathan Whitmore writing his careful 4-paragraph letter, the names of attorneys, the offer of help extended without conditions attached. She thought about Luke sitting across from her writing the first letter to Nathan with a slightly set jaw and no complaint. I'll write to him again, she said. I already wrote him, Luke said. She looked up. He met her eyes with that particular expression, the almost smile that she had learned to recognize. On the road back, stopped for the night in a place with a writing desk. It seemed efficient. Hannah looked at him for a moment. You're not as slow as you appear. Nobody is, he said. Nathan's response was the fastest yet, 4 days, which suggested he had not waited before starting to ask questions. The letter was longer this time. He had, he wrote, made inquiries among people he trusted in Cheyenne's business community regarding Gerald Howell and the Meridian Land Company. What he had found was that Howell was not well liked, not because he was obviously dishonest, but because he operated in a manner that made other businessmen uncomfortable. He moved on information no one else had. He positioned himself ahead of announcements. He was never explicitly accused of anything, but he was the kind of man whose success generated private resentment because it didn't feel entirely earned. More concretely, Nathan had spoken to a man who sat on a bank board with Gerald Howell, who had mentioned, cautiously, not for attribution, that Meridian had recently drawn down a significant line of credit, large enough to suggest they expected to need capital for something substantial, an acquisition perhaps, or a legal defense. Nathan also wrote that he had used his contacts to confirm the name of the registered law firm and its connection to the Land Commission. He did not say how he'd confirmed it. He did say that he had a contact at the Cheyenne Courier-Circuit, the territorial newspaper, who covered land and infrastructure issues, and who, in Nathan's opinion, was the kind of journalist who understood the difference between rumor and story. At the bottom of the letter, below his signature, he had added one line. If you can document the connection between Peel and Howell, the rest takes care of itself. Hannah read that line 3 times. Then she set the letter down and picked up her notes and looked at what they had. The filings, the pattern, the social columns, the law firm, the credit line, the contested 1879 ruling. Each piece by itself was suggestive. Together, they told a story. But Nathan was right. The connection between Peel and Howell was the center of it. Everything else was circumstantial without that. She went to find Fitch, who was still in Red Creek, staying at the hotel and working through the property documents with the thoroughness of a man billing by the hour. The law firm, she said, sitting down across from him in the hotel dining room. If the same firm registered Meridian's incorporation and handles Peel's private business, are there documents that show that? Something findable? Fitch considered. Incorporation documents are public record in the territory. Peel's private business arrangements are not unless they've been recorded for some purpose, property, contract, that sort of thing. He tapped his pen on the table. But if Peel has any property holdings that were handled by this firm, those recordings would be in the land office, public record. So we look for Peel's property filings. It's a place to start. If his name appears in the same filing records as the law firm's name, same attorney signature, same notary, that's a documented connection. Not proof of conspiracy, but it puts them in the same room legally. I need someone who can search those records. I can make a request to the land office on your behalf. As an attorney of record on a pending dispute, I have standing to review related filings. He looked at her over his glasses. It will take a week, perhaps 2. Then start today, she said. But the 6-week window on the Meridian notices was expiring. 3 weeks in, with time running short, Aldous Crane made his first direct move. He sent a letter, not to the ranchers this time, but to Frank Daly at the Red Creek Land Claims Office, notifying the office that Meridian intended to file a formal territorial challenge to all 5 disputed properties and requesting that the office prepare the relevant records for transfer to the territorial court. When Frank Daly brought the letter to Hannah, he was visibly anxious in a way that suggested he now understood he was standing in the middle of something bigger than he'd signed up for. They're moving fast, he said. They're moving because they know we've been asking questions, Hannah said. She kept her voice even. If they formally file in territorial court, that starts a clock. Fitch needs to counterfile before the deadline. Can he do that? Do we have enough? We have enough to establish standing to challenge, she said. Whether we have enough to win is a different question. She sent a message to Fitch within the hour. Fitch, to his credit, was not rattled. He had been expecting this, he said, and had already drafted a counterfiling. He would need the ranchers to sign it by Friday. Getting 5 people to sign the same document by Friday was its own kind of work. Clara Voss signed it without reading past the first paragraph, which either meant she trusted Fitch or she trusted Hannah, and both possibilities felt significant. Haskell read every word, asked 3 questions, and signed. The Pruitt brothers had a disagreement about something unrelated that delayed things by half an afternoon until Henry Pruitt's wife came out onto the porch and said something sharp to both of them that ended the matter. Luke signed it last, on Friday morning at Hannah's kitchen table, and when he set down the pen, he looked at her. This is the point where it either works or it doesn't, he said. Yes. You know that. I know that. He nodded. He didn't try to make it better than it was, which was one of the things she had come to rely on from him, the refusal to dress things up. It was honest, and honesty was something she could work with. Fitch filed in territorial court on Friday afternoon. What happened next was a week of terrible waiting, the kind that had texture to it, not empty but filled with small, anxious activities that didn't quite distract but kept the hands busy. Hannah baked. Luke mended fence. Clara Voss, according to Haskell, was reorganizing her grain storage, which meant she was nervous. The Pruitt brothers apparently went very quiet, which worried their wives. On the 8th day of waiting, Fitch received a response from his land office request. He came to Hannah's bakery with it after closing time, which told her something about its importance before he'd said a word. He sat at her counter with the papers in front of him and took off his glasses and polished them and put them back on. "I have Peel's property filings from the last 12 years, he said. 14 transactions. In 9 of them, the attorney of record is a man named Silas Greer. He looked at her. Silas Greer is a senior partner at the firm that registered the Meridian Land Company. The bakery was quiet. "Same attorney," Hannah said. "Same attorney, which means Peel has an established legal relationship with the firm that created Meridian, a firm whose other major client is Gerald Howell." He set the papers down. "That is a documented connection. It doesn't prove Peel told Howell about the rail corridor, but it puts them in the same legal structure. And in the context of 47 filings, a contested ruling, and a rail spur that benefits exactly the land Meridian has been targeting, it becomes very hard to explain otherwise," Hannah said. "It becomes a story," Fitch said, "which is what your contact at the newspaper needs." Hannah looked at him. "You think we should go to the newspaper now, before the court rules?" "I think," Fitch said carefully, "that courts are slow, and newspapers are not. And I think that a company that is currently under a territorial court challenge, and simultaneously the subject of a published investigation into its principles, has significantly less appetite for a protracted legal fight than a company that is operating in the dark." He paused. "I also think Arthur Peel is a political appointee who values his position and would not survive the public scrutiny of having his name attached to this." Hannah sat with that for a moment. It was not a sure thing. She understood that. Newspapers could be wrong, could be challenged, could cause damage in directions you hadn't intended. And she was a baker in Red Creek, Wyoming, not someone who had experience managing these kinds of consequences. But she thought about 5 ranches. She thought about Clara Voss's hayfield and Haskell's 40 years and the creek that ran through Luke's eastern 60 acres. She thought about 47 filings across the territory and the ranchers up near Casper, who had taken settlements and probably still lay awake at night wondering if they'd been cheated. She thought about what it meant to have information and not use it. "Write up what you have," she told Fitch. "Everything documented. I'll contact Nathan about the journalist." She wrote the letter to Nathan that evening, and she wrote it clearly and specifically and without hedging. She had found, in the past month, that hedging was something she had less and less patience for, in correspondence and in life. She said what she had. She said what she needed. She asked Nathan to make the introduction to his contact at the Cheyenne Courier. Then she set the letter aside and looked at her kitchen table, at the maps and the notes and the lists of names and the growing stack of Fitch's annotated documents, and thought about how none of this was what she had expected her summer to look like when she'd been planting sweet peas in May. She was still sitting there when she heard the back door open. Luke came in the way he'd been coming in for the past month. No knock anymore, which had started the second week of June and which she had not commented on because it would have required saying out loud that it meant something. He looked at the letter. He looked at her face. "Nathan's journalist?" he said. "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the papers on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "This could go wrong," he said. "I know. If the paper runs a story, and it's challenged, if Crane comes back at us in court, and we don't have enough." "I know, Luke." He was quiet. Then, "All right." "All right? I trust you." He said it the way he said important things, without decoration, set down on the table like a fact. "I've watched you do this for a month. You're the sharpest person I know. I trust you." Hannah held his eyes across the table. There were things she could have said about the risk, about the uncertainty, about all the ways this could end badly. She didn't say any of them. "I'll send it in the morning," she said. He reached across and covered her hand with his. Not briefly this time. He left it there, warm and solid, while the lamp burned between them and outside Red Creek settled into its ordinary night. The sweet peas were blooming. The letter was sealed. In Cheyenne, a journalist had not yet received a letter that would change what he thought his week looked like. And in the files of the Territorial Land Office, 14 property transactions with a single attorney's signature were waiting to be understood by someone willing to look at what they actually meant. Hannah turned her hand over beneath his and held on. The letter reached the Cheyenne Courier in 4 days. Nathan's journalist was a man named Douglas Hare, and he responded not with a letter but by appearing in Red Creek on a Tuesday morning, which was faster than anyone had anticipated, and suggested he had been looking for exactly this kind of story for longer than Hannah had been looking for him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 32, with a notebook already open when he stepped off the coach and the particular alertness of someone who processed the world primarily by writing it down. He came to the bakery first because Nathan had told him to. He sat at Hannah's small table by the window and drank coffee and asked questions for 2 hours. And Hannah answered what she could and directed him to Fitch for the legal detail and to Luke for the property specifics. She was careful about what she said and what she didn't say, which Hare seemed to respect. He was not the kind of journalist who pushed for more than was there, just the kind who made sure he understood exactly what was. The Peel connection, he said at one point, looking at his notes. You have the documented attorney relationship. You have the social record. You have the timing. He looked up. What you don't have is anyone saying directly that Peel told Howell about the corridor. No, Hannah said. Does Fitch think that matters? Fitch thinks the documented pattern is sufficient to ask the question publicly. He thinks the question itself is enough. Hare considered this. He had a habit of tapping his pen against his notebook when he was thinking that she imagined he was probably unaware of. Sometimes the question is enough, he said. If Peel's name is in print alongside Meridian's and there's a reasonable documented connection, the people who matter politically will start asking their own questions. Men in those positions can't afford the scrutiny even if they survive it. That's what Fitch believes. Fitch is usually right about these things. He wrote something. I'll need a week. I want to verify the attorney records independently before we publish anything. Do what you need to do, Hannah said. But the court timeline, I know. He closed the notebook. I'll be fast. He was. The story ran in the Cheyenne Courier 9 days later, on the front page below the fold, which Hannah was told was significant positioning for something that wasn't an outright crime, but a documented pattern of concern. The headline was measured. Meridian Land Company disputes raise questions about territorial commission ties. Not an accusation, a question. Carefully documented, citing the incorporation records, the attorney connections, the pattern of filings, the contested 1879 ruling, and the unannounced rail corridor that just happened to run through every piece of land Meridian was targeting. Arthur Peel's name appeared in the 4th paragraph. Hannah read the story on a Saturday morning, standing at her bakery counter with flowers still on her hands, because Frank Daly had brought a copy of the paper in from the mail delivery and set it down in front of her without a word. She read it twice. Then she set it down and went back to her bread, because the bread needed attention and standing still with complicated feelings was something she'd always found easier in motion. By Monday, she had received 3 pieces of information from 3 different directions in the span of a single afternoon. The first came from Fitch, who sent a message saying that Aldous Crane had filed a motion in territorial court requesting a 60-day extension on the challenge proceedings. In Fitch's professional opinion, this meant Crane's clients were reconsidering. The second came from Nathan, who wrote that Arthur Peel had announced he was taking a temporary leave of absence from the Territorial Land Commission for personal health reasons. Nathan's note was brief. Personal health. Yes. The third came from Haskell, who rode into town in the middle of the afternoon looking like a man who had received unexpected news. He came directly to the bakery and set his hat on her counter and said, I got a letter from Aldous Crane this morning. He's withdrawing the notice on my property. Hannah put down her cloth. Just like that? She said. Just like that. No explanation, no settlement offer, just, the company is withdrawing its claim. Haskell looked at her. He was not a man who showed emotion easily, and right now his face was doing something complicated. Claire Voss got the same letter. Pruitt brothers, too. Luke? Don't know. Rode here first. She untied her apron. Watch the counter for 10 minutes, she said. She found Luke's letter in her front mail slot when she checked. She hadn't looked yet that morning, too busy with the early customers. She brought it back inside and opened it at the counter while Haskell stood there watching. It was from Crane's office, the same as the others. 2 sentences. The claim was being withdrawn. The company would not be pursuing the territorial court filing. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the counter next to Haskell's hat and stood there for a moment with a feeling she didn't quite have words for. Not triumph, exactly, which was what she'd imagined she might feel when this was over. More like the particular exhaustion of a long effort finally ending, and underneath that something quieter and more real. Relief. Just ordinary relief. "It's done," Haskell said. "For now," she said. Because that was the true thing, not the comfortable thing. Meridian might regroup, Howell might find another angle. The territory's legal machinery was slow and imperfect and would not fix everything at once. But for the 5 ranches in the corridor, for the hayfield and the water access and the 40 years of work that had almost been taken by a filing and a lawyer who knew which rulings to exploit, for now, it was done. "I'll ride out and tell Luke," she said. "I'll do it," Haskell said. "You've been in this bakery since 2 in the morning. Stay put." She almost argued. Then she looked at him, at the old rancher who had spent 3 weeks signing documents and talking to lawyers and driving to meetings and doing all of it without complaint, because the alternative was losing everything his life had been built on. And she said, "Thank you, Bill." He picked up his hat. "Don't thank me. You're the one who figured out there was something to find." He left. Hannah stood at her counter in the quiet bakery and let herself be still for a moment. Outside, Main Street was doing what it did on a Monday afternoon in June. Unhurried, ordinary, people going about the business of their ordinary lives. She thought about 47 filings. She thought about the ranchers near Casper who had settled and taken their reduced parcels and called themselves lucky. She thought about whether any of this would reach back far enough to help them, and suspected the honest answer was probably not, or not easily. The law moved toward resolution when it moved at all, and it did not often move backward. She couldn't fix everything. She had known that from the beginning, but she had done what was in front of her to do, and sometimes that had to be sufficient. She put her apron back on and finished the bread. Dish. Luke came in on Thursday carrying wildflowers again, not the small, bedraggled bunch of the first time, but a proper armful of them, the late June kind that grew along the south-facing slopes, yellow and purple, and the particular deep orange that only lasted a few weeks in the Wyoming summer. He set them on the counter without ceremony and looked at her. "Haskell told me you found out the same day he did, and sent him out to tell me instead of coming yourself," he said. "I had bread in the oven." "Hannah." It was a critical stage of the bake. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had come to understand as his version of exasperated fondness, which was a thing she would not have believed he was capable of 4 months ago. "Is the ranch safe?" he said, "because of a journalist who ran a story, or because of the person who figured out there was a story and found the journalist and spent 2 months in her kitchen doing the work that made the story possible?" She moved the wildflowers into the cracked clay jar that had become their permanent home on her counter. "Both," she said. "The story mattered, Fitch mattered, you going to Cheyenne mattered, Nathan's contacts mattered. And you." She looked at him. "And me." He nodded, like that was all he'd needed. He bought his bread, same as always, and stayed for the better part of an hour talking about the ranch, the fence that still needed finishing, a new horse he was considering, the creek running high this summer, which was good for the grazing land. Ordinary things. She listened and she talked back, and the morning light moved across the floor and the wildflowers sat in their jar. And it was, she thought, just about the best hour she could remember in recent experience. He paused at the door when he left. "Sunday," he said. "What's Sunday?" "Come out to the ranch. Stay for supper." He looked at her steadily. "I want to show you something." She thought about what it meant, being invited to the ranch for supper rather than the hotel dining room. It was a different thing. She thought he knew it was a different thing, and that he was saying it deliberately. "All right," she said. "I'll come into town and ride out with you." "You don't have to do that. I know the way." "I know you know the way." He looked at her. "I want to come." She looked back at him. "All right," she said again. Sunday was one of those days the Wyoming summer produced occasionally, not too hot, with a good wind off the mountains and the sky, the particular shade of blue that made you understand why people had decided to stay in this country despite everything it required of them. Hannah rode out with Luke in the late afternoon, down the road she had ridden alone 4 months ago in the cold, and the landscape was so different from that night. green and wide and lit up, that it almost felt like a different road. The ranch looked good. She'd seen it in winter and in early spring, but summer was different. The pasture full and green, the creek running clean through the eastern 60 acres she had spent 2 months helping to protect. The horses moving in the far field with the unhurried ease of animals that had enough space and enough water and nothing to run from. Luke showed her the thing he'd wanted to show her. It was the creek bank on the eastern edge, where he'd recently cleared some scrub growth. And in the clearing you could see across to a long slope that in the evening light was covered in wildflowers, the same varieties he'd been bringing her all summer, growing wild on the hillside in a wash of color that had no purpose except its own existence. She stood at the creek bank and looked at it. "They grow there every year," he said. "My mother planted the first ones before I was born. The rest seeded themselves out from there." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been picking them from there, all summer?" "Yes." She didn't say anything. She didn't have an immediate word for what that information did, so she just looked at the hillside and let it settle. "This is what was almost gone," she said finally. "Not a question. Part of it." She turned and looked at him, at the creek, at the land, at the man who had spent 3 years not saying things and was now, slowly, getting better at saying them. At the ranch that was still his, because 5 people had been willing to act like the problem belonged to all of them, rather than separately to each. "I'm glad we didn't lose it," she said. "I'm glad you didn't let us," he said. He said it simply, no performance in it. She had learned, in 4 months of knowing Luke Carter as more than a Thursday customer, that he said important things simply, set them down like stones, solid and without decoration, and let them sit. She had learned to trust that what he said was what he meant. She thought about the version of herself from April, standing behind her counter, watching him leave on Thursdays, telling herself sensible things about customers and decency, and not confusing different kinds of warmth. That woman had spent a long time being careful. Being careful had its uses. She wasn't going to pretend it didn't. But there was a version of careful that was just fear with better manners, and she had been living in that version for longer than she cared to count. "Luke," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." He looked at her with a slight wariness that was fair, given that the last time she'd said those words she had confessed to loving him in a barn and turned his Thursday routine upside down. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. I know I said I'd have an answer for Nathan before I knew anything about what you felt. And I know the summer got complicated before we had a chance to figure out what any of this actually looks like. But I'm not going anywhere." She held his eyes. "I'm saying it plainly so there's no ambiguity. I know you tend to decide things in your head when there's ambiguity." The almost smile, she was so familiar with it now. "That's fair," he said. "I'm just preventing the problem early." "I appreciate the efficiency." She laughed, a real one, which came out before she'd managed to be self-conscious about it. He watched her laugh with that expression she had no prior name for, and had eventually decided was just what it looked like when Luke Carter was thoroughly happy about something. He reached into his coat pocket, and she expected nothing in particular. Maybe something ranch-related, a tool, whatever. And instead he produced a ring. Small, plain, a band of silver with a single flat-cut stone the color of the Wyoming sky on a good day. Not fancy. It had the look of something that had been kept somewhere for a little while, thought about. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I was going to wait," he said. "Thought I'd wait until things were more settled, until the Meridian business was done and there was less going on." He turned the ring in his fingers. "But I've already spent 3 years waiting for a better time to say something, and I know how that goes." She was very still. I know this isn't," he started and then stopped himself, because that was the old pattern and he was trying not to do it. "I know what I've got to offer is a ranch that needs work, and a dog that doesn't like anyone, and a man who talks less than he should." He paused. "But I'm asking." "You haven't actually asked," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Hannah Brooks," he said. "Will you marry me?" The creek moved. The horses stood in the far field. The wildflowers grew on his mother's hillside in the evening light, seeding themselves out year by year without anyone arranging them. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes. He put the ring on her finger. It fit reasonably well, which she suspected meant he had asked someone her approximate size, and she thought about who he might have asked and decided she would find out later. He held her hand for a moment and looked at it. She looked at it too, at her flower-roughened hand with a ring on it, standing at a creek bank on a summer evening on land that had almost been taken and wasn't. "Mabel Hutchins is going to have opinions," she said. "Yes." "Very loud ones." "Probably." She looked up at him. "Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready for 4 months," he said. "I just didn't have the ring yet." So, they were married in September in the yard behind Hannah's bakery because the church steeple was still listing and someone said it was inadvisable. The sweet peas had gone to seed by then, but she had kept some of the dried stalks along the fence because she liked the way they looked. Clara Voss came and sat in the front row without being asked, which was the highest form of approval Clara was capable of demonstrating. Haskell came and brought his wife, and both of them cried, which surprised everyone, including Haskell. The Pruitt brothers came and behaved themselves. Old Dempsey, the schoolteacher, came and gave a reading that was slightly too long but very sincere. Frank Daly came. Even Sheriff Beaumont came, standing in the back in the non-committal way of a man who wanted to be present without being implicated. Mabel Hutchins came too, which Hannah had not expected. She sat near the middle and was quiet through most of it, and afterward she came and found Hannah and stood in front of her for a moment with an expression Hannah couldn't quite read. Something effortful in it, like a woman working against her own habits. "You look well," Mabel said. "Thank you, Mabel." A pause. "I was wrong," Mabel said, "about certain things. I want you to know I understand that." It was not an apology exactly. It was about as close as Mabel got to one, which Hannah had come to understand was not a small thing. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it, without the sting she might have felt 4 months earlier, because she had spent enough of the summer being seen clearly by the people who mattered that the opinions of the people who didn't had lost some of their old power. Mabel nodded and moved off to find someone to talk to, and Hannah stood in her own backyard on her wedding day and watched Red Creek, her town, the one that had known her for 31 years and still managed to be surprised by her, and thought about what it meant to finally take up the space she'd always been entitled to. The territorial investigation into Arthur Peel and Gerald Howell developed slowly, the way official things did, over months, not weeks, with the grinding patience of an institution that was not designed for speed. Douglas Hare at the Cheyenne Courier continued to cover it, and 2 other papers eventually picked up the thread. By October, Peel had resigned from the Land Commission. By December, Howell had retained a new lawyer and was facing a formal inquiry into Meridian's corporate practices. What came of the inquiry, in the end, was not a criminal conviction. The territory's legal capacity for that was limited, and Howell's new lawyer was good. What came of it was a civil settlement in which Meridian agreed to withdraw all 47 outstanding property disputes, paid a penalty to the Territorial Land Fund, and dissolved as a company. Gerald Howell reorganized under a different name within 18 months, which was the kind of thing men like that did. Hannah read about the settlement in the Courier, which Fitch sent her a copy of with a note that said simply, "Well done, R. Fitch." She folded the paper and put it in the box where she kept important things, next to the letter from Nathan Whitmore and the copy of the territorial court filing with all 5 signatures on it. She would not pretend the outcome was everything it should have been. Men with money and lawyers moved differently through the machinery of consequences than other people, and that was a fact of the world she lived in and couldn't personally dismantle. But 47 properties were safe. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the specific and concrete thing she had set out to do, and it was done. In the years that followed, Hannah expanded the bakery. Not immediately. It took 2 more years of saving, and the larger oven she'd always wanted turned out to cost more than the estimate, which was irritating but not surprising. She hired a girl to help her in the mornings, a 17-year-old named Rosie, who was quick and serious and reminded Hannah enough of her younger self that she occasionally had to be careful not to say things that were more advice than instruction. She taught Rosie the bread the way her mother had taught her, by feel as much as formula, by paying attention to the dough rather than just following steps. She taught her how to manage an order rush when 3 things needed to come out of the oven at once. She taught her how to deal with difficult customers without losing herself in the process, which was a skill with applications well beyond baking. There were mornings, particularly in the second year, when things were still finding their shape. When Hannah caught Rosie watching her with the particular expression of a young woman taking mental notes, and she remembered being that age and watching her mother move through this same kitchen, and she thought about inheritance. Not money, not property, the other kind. The knowledge that gets passed between women in the spaces where they work. Luke came to the bakery every Thursday. He never stopped. He also came on Saturdays and now and then on Wednesdays when he was in town for supplies, and on whatever other day he felt like coming in, which was a right he exercised without apology. He always brought wildflowers from October through the spring, which was when the hillside bloomed. In summer, he brought other things. A melon once from Haskell's garden, a piece of carved wood he'd made during a long winter evening that she put on the windowsill. Once, inexplicably, a very small and completely useless brass compass that he offered without explanation and that she kept anyway. He was still too quiet sometimes. He still made decisions in his head before bringing them out, and she still called him on it every time, and he still looked like a man who understood he'd been caught doing something he'd agreed not to do. His border collie eventually tolerated her presence, which Luke treated as a significant victory, and she was inclined to agree. The ranch got better, year by year. Not fast, not dramatically, the way things improved when you worked at them steadily rather than in surges. New fence line, better water management in the south pasture, a second hired hand when the herd grew. They were not a smooth operation. They disagreed about things and said so, and sometimes the saying so was not graceful. He burned his own food and she overcommitted to projects, and they had a notable argument about whether to build a second structure on the ranch property that lasted 3 days and resolved itself less through either of them winning than through both of them getting tired of the argument and finding a compromise neither had originally proposed. This was, she was learning, how most things actually worked. There were mornings she stood in the bakery at 4 a.m. in the lantern light, same as she had for 13 years before he came into her life, and thought about what had changed and what hadn't. The work was the same work, the flour and the oven, and the particular satisfaction of making something that would go home with people and feed them. That hadn't changed. What had changed was something harder to name, some quality of the air around her, the sense that she was living in the full dimension of her life rather than a careful, reduced version of it. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been at 31, wrapping bread for Mabel Hutchins and managing her face, and watching Luke walk out the door every Thursday and calling the whole thing sensible. That woman had been competent and capable and profoundly lonely in a way she hadn't admitted to herself until it stopped being true. Loneliness was like that. You often didn't know how much of it you'd been carrying until someone helped you put it down. She did not think of herself as someone who had been rescued. She was clear about that in her own mind. Nathan Whitmore's admiration hadn't rescued her. Luke's love hadn't rescued her. She had ridden 9 miles in the cold on her own horse with her own decision to say what she felt, and she had spent 2 months at her kitchen table doing work that no one else was positioned to do, and those were things she had done. They belonged to her. What Luke had given her was not rescue. It was something different and in some ways more significant. He had been a person who saw her clearly and showed up consistently and stood beside her in public without apology, and over time, that had changed what she believed about what she deserved. That was a particular kind of gift. She didn't have a short word for it. Red Creek changed too, incrementally, the way small towns change, not because they decide to, but because the people in them change, and the town follows. Young women came to the bakery now in a way they hadn't when Hannah was simply the baker. They came for bread, but they stayed and they talked, and sometimes what they were really asking about was how you built something of your own, or how you knew when to stay and when to move, or how you dealt with people who had opinions about your choices. Hannah answered what she could honestly and admitted what she didn't know, and sent them home with something good to eat. She was careful to tell them, a person who had figured everything out. She was a person who had figured out a few specific things, at significant cost in time and in years of being quieter than she should have been. The cost was real, she said so, but she also said this, that there was a difference between being practical and making yourself smaller, and for a long time she had confused the two. Practical meant understanding your circumstances and working within them toward something real. Smaller meant deciding in advance that you weren't worth the full version of your own life. She had spent her 20s doing the second thing and calling it the first. and she didn't want to watch someone else make the same mistake for the same wrong reasons. She told Rosie some of this one morning in the third year while they were working side by side in the pre-dawn dark with the oven going and the town asleep. Rosie was quiet for a moment after, shaping a loaf with the focus of someone who was also doing something else. "How did you know?" she said. "When to stop being small?" Hannah thought about a cold night on a road south of town, about a horse that had turned its head and given her a skeptical look when she stopped in the middle of the road for the second time, about a barn and a lamplight, and a man turning around to find her standing in the doorway. "I ran out of reasons not to," she said. "All the practical arguments I'd been making, they were real arguments. But eventually I looked at them and I thought, the thing I'm protecting myself from is the same thing I'm keeping myself from, and I couldn't live with that." Rosie nodded slowly. "Also," Hannah said, "my horse judged me." Rosie looked up. "Long story," Hannah said. "The point stands." They worked in silence for a while, flour and warmth and the slow building certainty of dough becoming bread. Outside, Red Creek was still dark, still quiet, still not fully awake yet. In a few hours, the street would fill and the ordinary machinery of the day would start. People needing things, going places, having their opinions, living their lives. And Hannah Brooks, who had fed this town for going on 14 years, and who was harder to overlook than she used to be, would unlock the door and let them in. The bread was almost done. She could tell by the smell, even before she checked. A skill that had taken years to develop, and that she could not entirely explain except to say that some things you learned with your body rather than your mind. And once learned, they stayed. You stopped guessing, and you just knew. That was true of bread. It was true of other things, too. She pulled the first loaves from the oven, set them on the rack to cool, and felt the particular satisfaction of having done the thing she was good at, in the place she'd built for herself, in the life she'd chosen. Not a perfect life. She wouldn't have claimed that. But a real one, with the full weight and dimension that the word real implied. The difficulty and the warmth and the wildflowers in October, and the man 9 miles south who was probably already awake, and probably already burning his own breakfast, and who would come through her door on Thursday the same as he had for years and years running, a little later every spring, and not one Thursday missed. She turned back to the oven. There was more bread to make.